In this video, we're going to study the effects of lower future income. One real-world way in which this might come about is at the beginning of a recession, consumers start to get signals that their income in the future could be lower. Maybe they start to see colleagues at work being laid off. There's discussion in newspapers about firms that are cutting back on employment and so forth. And that starts to create the expectation that income in the future may be lower. So the question is, how would the consumers react to that kind of news? Well, let's go through this very systematically. Suppose that future income is expected to fall from YF1 to YF2. Now remember that output today is unchanged. So there's no change in the quantity of goods available today. And therefore, the supply curve is stationary. But at the original interest rate that you were in before the news arrived, you now have lower wealth because this object here is expected to decline. So even with no change in current income, if there's no change in the real interest rate, then wealth is lower. But now if wealth is lower, then in general, consumers are going to want to reduce both current and future consumption. And in particular, because they're thinking that income in the future is going to be lower, in order to smooth their consumption, what they're going to want to do is increase their savings today so that they can push more of today's income into the future. In general, the demand for goods today is going to depend on the real interest rate, on current income, and on future income. And so this decrease in wealth is going to shift down the demand for goods today. And as consumers try to save more, at that initial real interest rate, R1, there's going to be an excess supply of goods today. What is going to happen here, remember that in equilibrium, savings has to equal zero. So as consumers try to save more, this is going to end up pushing the real interest rate down. So let's go to this graph where we see this happening. The expectation of lower future output shifts the demand for goods today inward. Initially, we were at an equilibrium at point A. The supply of goods today is just equal to Y, and it's perfectly inelastic because these goods are just being endowed to the agents. There's no dependence of the quantity of goods on the real interest rate, which is what's on the vertical axis. So the initial equilibrium interest rate, R1, was such that people were happy consuming their current income. So C was equal to Y. But this expectation of lower future income induces them to reduce their demand for goods today because they want to increase their savings and push goods into the future. Lower demand for goods today means that at that initial interest rate, there's now an excess supply of goods. Remember, this is an excess supply of goods today. So how are you going to induce consumers to want to eat more today, to consume more today? The interest rate is going to have to fall. This real interest rate is the price of goods today in terms of goods tomorrow. And so when it falls, the quantity of goods demanded today rises. Consumers slide down this new demand curve from C to B. And this process continues until they are happy consuming their current endowment. And the only way that's going to happen is if the real interest rate falls sufficiently to make current consumption cheap enough so that people will go ahead and consume their endowment even though they're expecting less income in the future. So ultimately, what's going to have to happen is ultimately they have to consume their income. So their initial endowment hasn't changed. So consumption initially has to equal consumption after the change in expected future income. Future consumption is going to have to fall because future income is falling. Now, another interesting way to understand this is to think about what has to happen to wealth. What's happening here is at this new interest rate, R2, wealth is unchanged. So the present value of income at the original equilibrium has to equal the present value of income at the new equilibrium. And since YF2 is going down, what this suggests is that the real interest rate is going to have to fall by enough to ensure that there's no change in wealth. Why is it that there can be no change in wealth? Because consumers have to be content to consume their current income today. And that's the only way that'll happen is if there's in equilibrium no change in wealth.